When you imagine medieval warfare, you probably picture knights in shining armor charging across the battlefield. But what if I told you that their greatest struggle wasn't against swords or arrows, it was against hunger? Behind every march, every siege, and every victory was a question so ordinary it's almost invisible. What did thousands of men eat every single day to stay alive? In this story, we'll set aside the drama of battles and look closely at the bread, salted meat, and forgotten details of supply that truly kept medieval warriors on their feet. Stay with me, because the hidden story of how food shaped war is stranger and more important than you might think. Chapter 1. Bread, Salt, and Hard Realities. When you think of medieval warriors on campaign nights in armor, archers with longbows, or pikemen carrying long wooden shafts, it is easy to imagine the weapons and battles. What is less often imagined and far less glamorous is what those same men carried in their bags to eat. Without food, no army could move, fight, or survive. A campaign was as much about bread, grain, and salted meat as it was about swords and shields in the Middle Ages. An army's ability to feed itself was often the deciding factor between success and failure. Campaign logistics were not guided by maps of fortresses alone, but also by rivers, mills, and granaries. If soldiers went hungry, discipline broke down. Hunger could scatter even the largest force, turning would-be victors into ragged deserters. So what exactly did they eat? Let's begin with the staple that defined almost every medieval diet: bread. Bread as the backbone of survival. For most medieval soldiers, bread was the cornerstone of their meals. But the type of bread you ate depended entirely on your station. Knights and noblemen could expect wheat bread soft, pale, and made from finely milled flour. Common soldiers, however, received bread made from barley, oats, or rye, often mixed together into a dense loaf. In desperate times, bread might even include peas, beans, or ground-up acorns. This bread was not always fresh. Soldiers on campaign were frequently issued hard, dry loaves that could last for days. Sometimes, especially for long journeys, they carried hardtack, a rock-like biscuit made from flour and water, baked until it was nearly indestructible. Hardtack could last for months, but it was so tough that soldiers often had to soak it in broth, wine, or even water just to bite through it. Bread was not just food. It was a measure of morale. Chronicles from the Crusades note that when soldiers ran out of bread, morale collapsed. Men grumbled, deserted, or even mutinied. A hungry army was a defeated army. Long before the enemy struck, meat, salted, and preserved. When possible, medieval soldiers ate meat. Pork was the most common, since pigs could be salted, smoked, and preserved. Beef and mutton appeared less frequently, but salted fish was also a regular staple, especially during religious fasting days when the church forbade eating meat. Salted meat and fish were practical, but not pleasant. Imagine strips of beef boiled until most of the salt leached out, leaving behind a chewy, bland slab. Soldiers would sometimes stew this meat with whatever vegetables could be scavenged: onions, garlic, or dried peas, but salt itself was precious. Armies needed vast supplies, not just for seasoning, but for preservation. A sack of salt might be guarded as carefully as a wagon of weapons. Without salt, food rotted quickly. In summer campaigns, when meat spoiled in days, armies often relied heavily on dried legumes, bread and cheese, ale, wine, and water. Marching soldiers needed to drink, but clean water was not always available. In fact, many soldiers avoided plain water altogether, fearing illness. Instead, ale and wine were the everyday drinks of an army. Ale was low in alcohol, brewed quickly, and often cloudy with yeast. It was not meant for taste, but for hydration. Soldiers might drink a gallon of ale in a single day. Wine, on the other hand, was preferred by knights and wealthier soldiers, especially in southern Europe. Cheap wines were thin and sour, but they were safer than untreated water. When water was used, it was often flavored with vinegar or herbs. partly to disguise taste and partly to reduce the risk of disease. Soldiers who drank straight from streams risked dysentery. One of the great silent killers of armies, cheese, onions, and the humble pea. Beyond bread and meat, a few other foods sustained medieval armies. Cheese was common, as it kept longer than milk and could be carried without spoiling quickly. Hard cheeses, such as those made from sheep or goat's milk, might last for weeks. Onions and garlic were small, portable, and added flavor to otherwise dull rations. Peas, beans, and lentils were dried and carried in sacks, ready to be boiled into a thick porridge. Chroniclers from the 100 Years' War mention vast kettles of peas and beans cooking over open fires in English camps, filling the air with an earthy, bland aroma. Feeding knights versus feeding common soldiers. Knights and nobles enjoyed more variety, at least when supply lines held. Their rations might include spiced wine, roasted fowl, fresh fruit, or even sweets. They had servants to cook, access to better supplies, and often the means to buy from local markets, but common soldiers were not so lucky. They relied on standard rations, bread, cheese, dried peas, and salted meat if it was available. In lean times, they foraged, hunted, or stole from nearby villages. Soldiers who marched across enemy territory often left ruin in their wake. As armies looted grain, livestock, and anything edible. The problem of supply, one of the greatest challenges in feeding medieval armies, was transportation. Wagons could carry sacks of flour, barrels of ale, and salted meat, but roads were poor and wagons slow. A single horse needed its own fodder, meaning supply trains consumed as much as they carried. Armies marching deep into enemy land often found themselves cut off, forced to live off the countryside. That was why grain mills, barns, and villages became prime military targets. Destroying your enemy's supplies was as effective as defeating him in battle. It is no accident that many medieval campaigns were decided not by pitched battles, but by sieges, blockades, and starvation. Closing thought. As you picture the life of a medieval soldier, imagine the weight of his armor, the strain of marching for miles, and then the simple relief of being handed a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a mug of ale. This food was not luxurious, but it was survival. Without it, no knight, archer, or man-at-arms could fight. And yet, this was only the beginning. For when armies moved into foreign lands, when supplies ran thin, and when campaigns dragged on for months, the question of food became more complicated and more desperate. Chapter 2. Foraging, Plunder, and the Taste of Desperation. When an army set out from its home base, it often carried enough food to last a week or two. After that, the soldiers depended on what they could find or take from the lands they crossed. Campaigns were as much about logistics as about swords, and the further an army marched from its homeland, the greater the strain on its stomachs. In this section, you'll discover the less glamorous reality, how soldiers fed themselves when supplies dwindled, and what survival really looked like when hunger crept into the ranks. The official system versus the unofficial reality. Kings, lords, and commanders always planned to supply their armies properly. Grain was purchased in bulk, herds of livestock were driven behind marching troops, and supply depots were arranged along the route. But these official plans rarely survived long campaigns. Roads were poor. Wagons broke down. Drivers deserted. Livestock died or wandered away. And so, official supplies dwindled, and soldiers turned to unofficial methods. Foraging, requisitioning, and outright looting. Foraging, the army as a moving harvest. Foraging was the polite term for soldiers moving into villages and fields to collect food. Sometimes this was organized. Commanders sent out foraging parties with carts and armed guards, who scoured the countryside for grain, vegetables, or livestock. At other times, it was chaotic, with soldiers rushing into farmyards and grabbing whatever they could carry. Foraging was not just about hunger, it was about control. A commander who kept his army fed through foraging had a chance of maintaining discipline. But when foraging broke down into looting, chaos spread. Soldiers fought over food, pillaged indiscriminately, and often brutalized the local population. Farmers learned to hide their grain and livestock. Chronicles describe villagers burying sacks of wheat underground or driving their herds deep into forests to escape the army's reach. Still, armies were persistent. A campaign that lasted weeks could strip entire regions bare, leaving nothing behind but trampled fields and empty houses. Requisition and living off the land in theory. Armies sometimes practiced requisition instead of looting. This meant taking food but promising payment, often in the form of official notes redeemable later, or coins stamped by the crown. In practice, soldiers rarely paid fairly. Many peasants never saw their promised compensation. But requisition did have one advantage. It allowed armies to avoid alienating local populations, at least in friendly or allied territories. When marching through their own lands, kings preferred requisition over looting. When marching through enemy lands, however, looting became the norm, not the exception. The English during the 100 Years' War made a deliberate strategy of chevauchee large-scale raids designed to devastate the French countryside, burn crops, loot villages, and demoralize the population. In these campaigns, feeding the army and destroying the enemy's resources were one and the same. Meat on the march, livestock as mobile rations. Livestock was one of the most practical forms of food on the move. Armies often brought herds of cattle, sheep, or pigs along with them. These animals grazed during the day, walked with the army, and were slaughtered as needed. The downside? Animals moved slowly, and they required their own food and water. In wet seasons, herds churned roads into mud. In dry summers, they grew weak and thin. Still, a herd of cattle was a lifeline for an army cut off from its supply depots. Sometimes armies seized animals from villages. The slaughter was often immediate, and fresh meat went into cooking pots that very night. Chronicles tell of soldiers boiling beef in helmets or roasting meat on hastily sharpened sticks over open flames. Nothing was wasted. Bones were cracked for marrow, hides used for leather, and fat rendered for cooking, ale, wine. And the problem of drunken soldiers. Even when food was scarce, drink was nearly always found. Soldiers drank ale or beer in Northern Europe, wine in Southern Europe, and sometimes both when campaigns crossed regional boundaries. But alcohol created problems. Supplies spoiled quickly, barrels leaked, and drunkenness was common. Some armies rationed drink carefully, while others allowed free indulgence, leading to disorder. Water remained risky, but in times of desperation, soldiers drank from rivers, lakes, or even ditches. The consequences were predictable: outbreaks of dysentery, diarrhea, and death. One English chronicler during the Crusades noted that more soldiers died from bad water than from enemy swords. When supplies ran out, the taste of desperation. What happened when foraging and requisition failed? Hunger forced soldiers into grim improvisations. Accounts survive of armies eating horses, dogs, and even rats during prolonged sieges or disastrous marchers. In extreme cases, starvation led to cannibalism, though these were rare and usually recorded with horror by chroniclers. During the First Crusade, starving soldiers boiled animal hides, chewed leather straps, and gnawed on grass. At the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099, reports describe men so desperate that they ate whatever could be boiled in water. Hunger eroded morale faster than battle. A hungry soldier could not fight, and hungry armies often disintegrated. Commanders understood this well, which is why supply was often more decisive than strategy. Food and siege warfare. Sieges presented their own special problems. An army encircling a city needed to feed itself while cutting off supplies to the enemy. Often, the sieging army starved almost as much as the defenders. In long sieges, supply lines became lifelines. If they were broken, the besiegers faced the same fate as those trapped inside the walls. Chronicles from the Siege of Acre, 1189 to 1191, describe both besiegers and defenders suffering hunger, eating weeds and fighting over scarce bread. Inside besieged cities, people resorted to eating horses, dogs, and in some cases, even leather. Bread baked with sawdust or acorn flour was common. Starvation was a weapon as powerful as any catapult, the human side of hunger. To imagine the experience of a medieval soldier, think not only of swords and armor, but also of the hollow ache of hunger after days of poor rations. Imagine waiting in line for a scrap of bread, sharing a pot of watery pea stew with a dozen comrades, or boiling strips of salted beef until they were barely edible. Hunger-shaped mood and morale. It bred resentment toward commanders, cruelty toward villagers, and desperation in the ranks. Hunger was not just a physical state, it was a political and military force that could topple kings and decide the fate of campaigns. Closing thought, food, or the lack of it shaped every campaign. Victories were won not only on battlefields, but in barns, mills, and fields of grain. To march an army across Europe required more than swords and shields, it required bread, meat, and endless patience. Yet even when food was found, there remained the challenge of preserving it, distributing it, and keeping it from rotting on the march. In the next section, we'll turn to the strategies medieval commanders developed to manage these endless problems, the systems of rationing, storage, and transport that kept armies alive. Chapter 3: Rations, Preservation, and the Long Shadow of Logistics. If you've followed the soldiers from their initial rations to the desperation of foraging and hunger, you might already sense that medieval warfare was as much about the stomach as the sword. In this final section of the story, we'll look at the more structured side of feeding armies, the systems of rationing, preservation, storage, and transport, which reveal just how much thought, planning, and routine went into something as ordinary as a soldier's daily meal. While kings and generals gained glory for victories in battle, behind those triumphs lay the dull but critical details of how food was organized, measured, and kept from spoiling. The idea of rationing, medieval commanders learned early that food had to be measured out carefully if an army was to last through a campaign. Soldiers were often issued specific daily rations, usually calculated in terms of bread, grain, and sometimes meat. A standard ration varied by region and period, but an English soldier might receive 1 to 2 pounds of bread per day, often hard, dense loaves baked in bulk, about a pound of salted meat or fish when available, a small measure of ale or wine, a pint or more, depending on supply, occasional peas, beans, or cheese to supplement. This system was more consistent in well-organized armies, such as those raised by kings, than in the ad hoc forces raised by nobles for private wars. But even in the best cases, rations were often cut short when supplies dwindled. Soldiers learned to stretch meals, share among comrades, or simply go hungry. Bread, the cornerstone of campaign food. Bread was by far the most common ration. It was cheap, filling, and relatively portable. Armies often carried flour or grain, then baked bread in mobile field ovens. A campaign might include smiths and carpenters who built ovens from clay and stone once the army settled into camp. The bread was rarely the fresh, soft kind you might imagine. Instead, it was dense, dry, and sometimes mixed with peas, beans, or even sawdust when supplies ran short. Soldiers soaked it in broth or ale to make it edible. The monotony of bread rations was legendary. Many chronicles note soldiers complaining about endless loaves with little else to accompany them. Meat and salt. Preserving protein. Meat was prized but difficult to keep fresh. The solution was salting. Salted beef, pork, or fish could last weeks if kept dry. Armies carried barrels of salted meat, which were opened gradually. The process was hardly appetizing. Salted meat was tough, briny, and required long boiling to soften. Soldiers joked that the meat had to be beaten with hammers before cooking. Still, it was precious protein, and when combined with bread or grains, it gave energy for the march. Salt itself was expensive, sometimes called white gold. Whole. Trade networks existed just to supply armies with enough salt for preservation. An army without salt quickly became an army without meat. Fish, the influence of the church. Because medieval society followed the church calendar, which demanded many fasting days where meat was forbidden, fish played a central role in campaign diets. Dried or salted fish, particularly cod and herring, were traded in vast quantities across Europe. Armies on the march consumed these same foods. A soldier might chew on tough strips of dried cod or eat herring boiled in thin broth. Fish was not a luxury. It was routine, especially during Lent or on Fridays. The church's dietary rules followed armies even into the field, though in desperate times soldiers sometimes ignored them. Cheese, peas, and other staples. Cheese was another common ration, easy to carry, long-lasting, and filling. Hard cheeses traveled well and provided protein and fat. Peas and beans, dried and stored in sacks, were boiled into thick soups or thin pottages. These legumes were the backbone of peasant diets, and soldiers on campaign ate them just as often. A pot of pea soup might feed dozens, though it was bland and repetitive. Transport. The endless problem. How did armies actually move food? The answer was slow and inefficient. Carts pulled by oxen creaked under the weight of grain sacks and barrels. Pack horses carried smaller loads. Each cart or animal required its own fodder, which further complicated the supply chain. Roads were poor. Rain turned paths to mud. In mountainous regions, carts often broke or had to be abandoned. Rivers offered better routes, so commanders often tried to keep supply lines along waterways, using barges to move heavy loads. But this meant armies were tethered to supply lines, vulnerable to attack. Raiders who captured supply carts or blocked river traffic could starve whole armies. Many campaigns collapsed not from battle, but because supplies never arrived. The role of quartermasters and commissaries behind the fighting men were officials whose job was to calculate food needs, arrange purchases, and distribute rations. These men, often called quartermasters or commissaries, rarely appeared in heroic stories, but their role was vital. They inspected granaries, checked weights and measures, and issued daily allowances. They oversaw the baking of bread, the slaughtering of livestock, and the salting of meat. Without their constant attention, disorder would reign, yet these positions were also opportunities for corruption. Chronicles complain of quartermasters who skimmed food for themselves, issued short rations, or sold supplies on the side. Soldiers often distrusted them, and disputes over rations sometimes turned violent. Discipline and food. Food was not just sustenance. It was a tool of discipline. Commanders rewarded loyal troops with extra rations or better cuts of meat. Disobedient soldiers might see their rations cut. Victory feasts, even on campaign, boosted morale. A slaughtered ox, roasted whole, shared among hundreds of men, became a moment of celebration. Bread and meat, distributed fairly, reinforced trust between soldiers and leaders. Lessons from the Long March. Over time, European commanders began to see food supply as the true backbone of war. Castles were placed near fertile fields or rivers to secure supplies. Campaigns were often planned around harvest times, ensuring grain was plentiful. The English, during their wars in France, carried detailed supply records. The Burgundians organized grain depots. The Ottomans, too, built elaborate supply networks, with camel caravans carrying grain across long distances. In every case, the pattern was clear. No army could last without a steady flow of bread, meat, and drink. Closing reflection. So what kept medieval warriors alive on campaign? It was not only courage or weapons. It was bread baked in field ovens, meat salted in barrels, peas boiled into thin soup, and endless calculations about how far a sack of grain could be stretched. The next time you think of knights charging into battle, imagine instead the quartermasters weighing sacks of flour, the soldiers chewing on hard loaves, and the endless trudging of carts carrying salted beef. This was the hidden, boring reality of medieval warfare, the struggle to keep thousands of hungry mouths fed day after day. In the end, logistics, the dull details of supply, shaped the fate of kingdoms. Wars were won and lost not only with swords but with bread, barrels of salt, and the patience of men who endured hunger without collapsing. And yet, doesn't this raise a curious thought? If medieval war depended so heavily on food supply, can we really say that battles decided history, or was it bread itself, humble and monotonous, that held the power to make or break empires? Thank you for spending this quiet time with me here on Quiet Boring Sleep. I hope this little journey through medieval history has helped you relax, unwind, or maybe even drift towards sleep. If you'd like more calm stories like this, it would mean a lot if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll always have a place to return to whenever you need a little history and a little rest. Until next time, take care and sleep well.